It was February 7th, 1938. A cold wind swept off the Atlantic Ocean, rattling the palm trees that lined the streets of Miami Beach. Inside a Mediterranean-style villa overlooking the turquoise waters, an aging man lay still in his bed. His breathing had slowed through the night. By morning, Harvey Samuel Firestone, one of America's most powerful industrialists, was gone. He was 69 years old. The man who had risen from a small Ohio farm to build a tire empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars had died peacefully in his sleep, far from the smokestacks and rubber factories that bore his name. But back in Akron, Ohio, his true monument still stood. A mansion so grand, so sprawling, that locals simply called it the Castle. Harbel Manor. 118 rooms of limestone and marble, spreading across manicured grounds like a small European village dropped into the heart of America's rubber capital. The name itself was a love letter, a combination of Harvey and Idabell, his wife of 43 years. But behind the elegant facade and carefully tended gardens, behind the chandeliers and the servants' quarters and the private music rooms, lay a story far more complex than the fairy tale of an immigrant family's rise to fortune. This is the story of the Firestone family, of the mansions they built and the empire they created. It is a tale of ambition and innovation, of friendship with presidents and inventors. But it is also a story with shadows, of a rubber plantation carved from African soil that would haunt the family name for generations. To understand the mansion on the hill, we must first understand the boy from the farm that built a dreamer. On December 20th, 1868, in the small town of Columbiana, Ohio, a baby boy was born into a world of hard work and simple pleasures. Harvey Samuel Firestone entered life on his family's farm, a modest homestead built by his grandfather decades earlier. The Firestones had arrived in America in 1752, when Nicholas Feuerstein, Harvey's ancestor, emigrated from Alsace. The family name meant Flintstone in German, and somewhere along the way, it transformed into the English word we know today. Young Harvey was the second of 3 sons born to Benjamin and Catherine Firestone. His childhood was filled with the rhythms of rural life, the early morning chores, the smell of hay and animals, the endless cycle of planting and harvest. He attended a one-room schoolhouse not far from home, where he learned to read and write and do his sums. But even as a boy, Harvey showed a restless spirit that the farm could not contain. He loved the animals, especially the horses. He dreamed of becoming a horse trader, imagining himself bargaining for fine stallions at county fairs. When he was 10 years old, he tried to earn money selling vegetables, hoping to buy a horse of his own. The venture failed, but his father, seeing the determination in his son's eyes, eventually gave him one. Those long buggy rides across the rutted dirt roads of Ohio planted a seed in young Harvey's mind. He felt every bump, every jolt, every stone that rattled through the wooden wheels and up into his bones. Surely, he thought, there must be a better way. The rubber tire was still a novelty in those days, something you might see on a fancy carriage in the city. But Harvey Firestone remembered how it felt to be shaken and bruised on those country roads. Someday, he would do something about it. After graduating from Columbiana High School, Harvey moved to Cleveland to complete a business course. He was not interested in becoming a farmer. He wanted something more, something bigger. His chance came when he went to work for his uncle's company, the Columbus Buggy Works. There, surrounded by craftsmen building carriages, Harvey began to see the future. And the future, he realized, was not in buggies at all. It was in wheels, the birth of an empire. By 1896, Harvey Firestone had made a decision that would change his life forever. His uncle's buggy company had gone bankrupt, a victim of changing times and new technologies. But Harvey saw opportunity where others saw failure. He moved to Chicago and started a small company selling rubber tires for carriages. The work was hard, the profits slim, but Harvey believed in his product. 3 years later, he sold that company for nearly $42,000, a small fortune for a young man from Ohio. But Harvey was not satisfied with a comfortable retirement. He had bigger plans. In 1900, at the age of 31, he moved to Akron, Ohio, the emerging capital of America's tire industry. With $10,000 and a patent for a method of attaching rubber tires to rims, he founded the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. The timing could not have been better. The automobile industry was about to explode. In 1896, the Durize brothers had built the first production automobiles in America. Now, inventors and entrepreneurs across the country were racing to put the nation on wheels. Harvey Firestone intended to supply those wheels with tires. The early years were a struggle. Firestone's company started as a sales operation, purchasing tires from other manufacturers and reselling them. The profits were thin, and competition was fierce. But in 1930, Harvey made a crucial decision. He would manufacture his own tires, controlling every step of the process from raw rubber to finished product. It was a gamble that paid off spectacularly. In 1960, a young automaker named Henry Ford placed an order for 2,000 sets of tires. That single order launched Firestone into the big leagues. By 1913, annual sales had exceeded $15 million, and Firestone had joined the ranks of America's top 5 tire manufacturers, alongside Goodyear, Goodrich, U.S. Rubber, and Fisk. Harvey Firestone had arrived, but success on this scale demanded a home to match. The woman who inspired a mansion. Before there was Harbel Manor, before the 100-room palace or the private concerts or the gardens that stretched to the horizon, there was Idabell. Idabell Smith was born on November 10, 1874, in Minnesota City, Minnesota. Her father, George Smith, was an inventor who had developed a revolutionary flour milling process. Like Harvey, she came from a family that valued hard work and innovation. But Idabell's passions lay elsewhere. From childhood, she showed a gift for music. She studied piano and organ, developing a talent that would later make her a respected composer in her own right. She attended Alma College in Ontario, where she refined her musical abilities and developed an appreciation for culture and the arts. In 1895, when she was just 21 years old, Idabell married Harvey Firestone in Detroit. He was 27, a young man still building his career in the buggy business. Neither of them could have imagined where their journey would lead. Together, they raised 6 children. 5 sons who would all eventually work in their father's business, and 1 daughter. Harvey Jr., Russell Allen, Leonard Kimball, Raymond Christian, and Roger Stanley. The daughter, Elizabeth, would marry into another prominent family, though tragedy would touch her life early. As Harvey's fortune grew, so did Idabell's influence. She became a patron of the arts, a philanthropist, and eventually a composer whose work would reach millions. Her songs, including the beloved melodies that would become the theme music for the family's famous radio program, reflected her love of gardens, nature, and the people she cherished. When Harvey decided to build a home worthy of his achievements, Idabell was at the center of his vision. The name Harbel, that elegant combination of their 2 names, was his tribute to the woman who had stood beside him through every struggle and triumph. The mansion would not simply be a display of wealth, It would be a monument to their love. A castle rises in Akron. Construction on Harbel Manor began around 1913, as Harvey Firestone's empire was reaching new heights. The site he chose was in West Akron, a prestigious neighborhood where the rubber barons of the era were building their own monuments to success. Harvey wanted something that would stand apart, something that would rival the great estates of the East Coast and the manor houses of Europe. The architects delivered beyond his dreams. Harbel Manor rose from the Ohio landscape like something out of a fairy tale. The main structure alone contained over 50 rooms, though the entire estate, with its guest houses and service buildings, would eventually encompass 118 rooms in total. The style was grand and eclectic, drawing on European influences while remaining distinctly American in its scale and ambition. Inside, the rooms flowed one into another in a sequence designed to impress and delight. Marble floors reflected the light from crystal chandeliers. Hand-carved woodwork adorned the walls and ceilings. Fireplaces large enough to stand in dominated the main halls, their mantels imported from European estates. Every detail, from the doorknobs to the window frames, was chosen with care. But Harbel Manor was not merely a showpiece. It was a living, breathing home. The kitchen, hidden from guests in the tradition of great estates, could prepare meals for hundreds. Servants' quarters housed the small army of staff required to maintain such a palace. There were rooms for every occasion, from intimate family dinners to grand balls that might host the most powerful people in America. The grounds surrounding the mansion were equally impressive. Gardens stretched in every direction, planted with flowers that bloomed in careful succession through the seasons. Idabell, with her love of nature and beauty, oversaw much of the landscaping herself. Her passion for gardens was so well known that the famous plant hybridist David Burpee would later name a marigold in her honor, the Idabell Firestone marigold. Yet even as the mansion took shape, Harvey's ambition continued to grow. The estate was more than a home. It was a statement, a declaration that Harvey Firestone had arrived among the giants of American industry, and soon he would forge friendships with the greatest minds of his generation. The Vagabonds and the power of friendship. In the summer of 1915, something remarkable happened in California. Harvey Firestone found himself traveling with two men who would become his closest friends and most powerful allies. One was Henry Ford, the automobile magnate whose Model T was revolutionizing American life. The other was Thomas Edison, the inventor whose electric light bulb had transformed the world. These three titans of industry discovered they shared more than business interests. They shared a love of the outdoors, a curiosity about the natural world, and a boyish enthusiasm for adventure. From that California trip, an annual tradition was born. They called themselves the Vagabonds. Each summer, Ford, Edison, Firestone, and the naturalist John Burroughs would set out on camping trips across America. They traveled in caravans of cars and trucks, complete with servants, chefs, and elaborate camping equipment. The dining table they hauled with them could seat 20 people. Their tents were fitted with electric lights powered by portable generators. These were not ordinary camping trips. They were expeditions of the mind, gatherings where the most innovative thinkers of the age could exchange ideas far from the pressures of their boardrooms. Around campfires in the Adirondacks, the Great Smokies, and New England forests, the Vagabonds discussed everything from technology to philosophy to the future of America. The trips became legendary. Newspapers across the country followed their every move. When President Warren Harding joined them on an excursion in 1921, the nation watched with fascination. Here were the makers of modern America, roughing it together like adventurous boys, proving that even the richest men in the world still yearned for the simple pleasures of nature. For Harvey Firestone, these friendships were both personal and strategic. Ford was his biggest customer, ordering millions of tires for his automobiles. Edison's inventions were transforming industry, and his endorsement carried enormous weight. Together, the three men represented a new kind of American aristocracy, built not on inherited wealth, but on innovation and hard work. The vagabond trips continued until 1924, when the men grew older and the growing crowds of reporters and admirers made true relaxation impossible. But the bonds forged during those summer adventures lasted a lifetime. When Harvey Firestone died in 1938, the Ford and Edison families were among the first to arrive at his funeral. The search for rubber. By the early 1920s, Harvey Firestone faced a crisis that threatened everything he had built. The British and Dutch colonial powers controlled most of the world's rubber supply, and they were squeezing American manufacturers with high prices and restrictive policies. For a man who had built his fortune on rubber, this was an existential threat. Harvey Firestone was not one to accept defeat. If the Europeans controlled the rubber of Southeast Asia, he would find his own supply. In 1923, he sent experts to West Africa to survey the soil and climate. They returned with promising news. The tiny nation of Liberia, on Africa's western coast, had conditions perfect for growing rubber trees. In 1926, Harvey Firestone negotiated a deal that would change Liberia forever. The Liberian government granted his company a 99-year lease on up to 1 million acres of land. In exchange, Firestone would provide a $5 million loan to help the struggling nation pay its debts. It seemed like a partnership that would benefit everyone. The town that grew around the plantation was named Harbel, the same name Harvey had given his beloved Akron mansion. It was another tribute to his wife, another monument to the empire they had built together. Within a few years, the Firestone plantation in Liberia became the largest rubber operation in the world, spreading across hundreds of thousands of acres and employing tens of thousands of workers. But the story of Harbel, Liberia, was far darker than the story of Harbel Manor in Ohio. From the beginning, the plantation operated under conditions that would later be compared to the old southern plantations of the American past. The company town was segregated, with white managers living in elegant houses on hilltops, while African workers crowded into small one-room dwellings without electricity or running water. The labor practices were harsh. Workers faced daily quotas for tapping rubber trees, and those who fell short risked punishment or dismissal. The Liberian government, desperate for the revenue Firestone provided, looked the other way as local chiefs were pressured to supply workers, sometimes through force. In 1929, a Liberian king complained that the Firestone project had destroyed 9 towns in his territory and forced his people to choose between forced labor and emigration. The League of Nations investigated. Critics denounced the conditions as virtual slavery, but Firestone defended his operation, pointing to the schools, hospitals, and infrastructure the company had built. The plantation was bringing progress to a poor nation, the company argued. It was providing jobs and opportunity where none had existed before. This would be the great contradiction of the Firestone legacy. The same family that built Harbel Manor, that supported hospitals and schools and nursing programs in Ohio, that donated millions to Princeton University, had also created a system in Africa that exploited workers and displaced communities. The name Harbel meant one thing in Akron and something very different in Liberia: life at the castle. Back in Ohio, Unaware of, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the shadows gathering over their family name, the Firestones lived in splendor at Harbel Manor. Every morning, Harvey would walk the grounds of his estate, surrounded by flowers and trees, his mind already turning over the business problems of the day. By 10 o'clock, he would be at the office, ready to guide his company through whatever challenges awaited. But the evenings belonged to family and friends. Harbel Manor became famous for its hospitality. Politicians and businessmen, artists and intellectuals, all found their way to the Firestone table. The dining room could accommodate dozens of guests, and the kitchen staff stood ready to prepare anything from simple American fare to elaborate European cuisine. Idabell presided over these gatherings with grace and charm. Her musical abilities made her a natural hostess, and she often entertained guests with performances on the mansion's grand piano. The organ that filled the music room with sound would later be removed and installed in a memorial chapel after her death, a tribute to the music that had filled her life. For the Firestone children, growing up at Harbel Manor was an experience few could imagine. They had tennis courts and gardens, stables and swimming pools. They attended the best schools and traveled the world. Harvey Jr. followed his father into the business, eventually taking over as chairman of the company. The other sons found their own paths within the Firestone empire. In 1928, the family's influence reached even further when Idabell's music became the theme for a new radio program. The Voice of Firestone was one of the first shows to bring classical music to a mass audience. For 35 years, it would broadcast to millions of Americans, opening and closing with songs Idabell herself had composed. In My Garden and If I Could Tell You became familiar to listeners across the nation. Yet even as the Firestones enjoyed their golden age, change was coming. The Great Depression struck in 1929, threatening fortunes across America. Harvey Firestone responded with characteristic determination, cutting costs and prices while maintaining quality. The company survived the crisis without missing a dividend payment, a remarkable achievement in those dark years. But time was catching up with Harvey Firestone himself. By the middle 1930s, his health had begun to decline. He spent more time at his winter home in Florida, the oceanfront villa he called Harbel Villa. There, surrounded by palm trees and warm breezes, he could rest and remember the extraordinary journey that had brought him from an Ohio farm to the pinnacle of American industry. The funeral that followed was one of the largest Akron had ever seen. More than 12,000 people came to pay their respects. Representatives from the Ford and Edison families attended. Business leaders from across the nation gathered to honor a man who had started with nothing and built an empire. He was laid to rest in Columbiana Cemetery, returning at last to the soil that had shaped him. But his legacy would live on, for better and for worse, in the company that bore his name and the mansions that had witnessed his triumphs. Back at Harbel Manor, Idabell Firestone remained. At 63, she had lost the partner who had shared her life for more than 4 decades. But she was not alone. Her children rallied around her, and the great house continued to pulse with life. She would live there for another 16 years, maintaining the traditions her husband had established and continuing her musical compositions. The Voice of Firestone continued to broadcast, carrying Idabell's melodies into American homes every week. She was elected to the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers in 1948, a recognition of her artistic achievements beyond her role as a wealthy industrialist's wife. Her songs spoke of love and gardens, of loss and memory, themes that resonated with listeners who had never seen Harbel Manor but could feel the emotion in every note. Meanwhile, the Firestone Company continued to grow. Harvey Jr. had taken over as chairman, guiding the business through the challenges of the Second World War and into the prosperity that followed. The Liberia plantation remained the company's most profitable subsidiary, even as questions about its labor practices continued to surface. In 1950, workers on the plantation went on strike, demanding wages that met Liberian minimum wage laws. They were earning just 18 cents per day, among the lowest paid workers in the nation. The strike was crushed. Workers who refused to return to their jobs were evicted from company housing, their families forced to find shelter elsewhere. Yet the protests would not stop. Another massive strike in 1963 shut down the entire plantation for 2 weeks. The pattern of exploitation that had begun under Harvey Firestone Sr. continued under his sons, a dark chapter in a story that the family preferred not to tell. At Harbel Manor in Akron, these troubles seemed far away. The mansion continued to host gatherings, though perhaps less grandly than in Harvey's time. The gardens still bloomed with Idabell's beloved flowers. The music room still echoed with the songs she composed. It was a beautiful life, shielded from the harsher realities that supported it. On July 7, 1954, Idabell Firestone died at the age of 79. She had been ill for some time, but her passing still shocked those who loved her. Funeral services were held at Harbel Manor itself, in the grand rooms where she had lived and entertained for so many years. The Voice of Firestone broadcast a special memorial program featuring the songs she had written over a lifetime of creative work. With Idabell's death, a new question arose. What would become of Harbel Manor? The great house had been built for 2 people who were now both gone. The children had their own lives, their own homes. Maintaining a 100-room mansion required an army of servants and endless expenditure. The answer came 5 years later. In 1959, the decision was made to demolish Harbel Manor. The furniture was sold. The organ was removed and installed in a memorial chapel. And then the wrecking crews arrived. They tore down the walls that had witnessed so much history. They smashed the marble floors and ripped out the carved woodwork. Where Harbel Manor had stood for nearly half a century, there would soon be condominiums, modern apartments for a new generation. The Georgetown condominiums that rose on the site bore no trace of the castle that had preceded them. The name Harbel survived only in memory and in the distant African town where workers still tapped rubber trees for a company that bore the Firestone name. But this was not the end of the Firestone story in Akron. Across the street from where Harbel Manor had stood, another mansion remained. Harvey Jr. and his wife Elizabeth had built their own French chateau-style home in 1926. That mansion would survive where his father's palace had fallen, and in that survival lay the continuation of a complicated legacy. The wrecking ball had done its work. By the end of 1959, Harbel Manor existed only in photographs and memories. The 100-room palace that Harvey Firestone had built as a monument to his success lay in ruins, soon to be replaced by ordinary apartment buildings. Yet across the street, another Firestone mansion still stood, elegant and defiant against the march of time. This was the home of Harvey Firestone Jr. and his wife Elizabeth. Built in 1926, just as Harvey Sr.'s empire was reaching its peak, the French chateau-style residence was smaller than Harbel Manor, but no less refined. Its limestone walls and slate roof spoke of old European nobility transplanted to the hills of Ohio. Inside, nearly 14,000 square feet of living space held 7 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, and rooms designed to showcase one of the finest private art collections in America. Harvey Jr. had followed his father into the tire business, as all the Firestone sons were expected to do. He had graduated from Princeton University in 1920, the first of many family members who would attend that prestigious institution. After serving as a Navy pilot in the First World War, He returned to Akron and took his place in the family company. By 1948, he had risen to become chairman and chief executive officer. But Harvey Jr. was more than a businessman. He was a man of culture and refinement, qualities he shared with his remarkable wife. Elizabeth Park Firestone was a collector of extraordinary taste. She assembled vast collections of porcelain, furniture, fine art, silver, and couture fashion. Like a museum curator, she researched each piece carefully before purchase, then labeled and cataloged everything with meticulous precision. Their Akron mansion became a showcase for these treasures. The rooms were decorated in the Louis XVI style, with ornate crystal chandeliers, paneled walls, antique marble fireplaces, and gilded mirrors that caught the light and multiplied the beauty around them. It was a home designed not merely for living, but for appreciating the finest achievements of human craftsmanship. The wedding that united two dynasties. In 1947, something happened that would bind the Firestone family to another of America's great industrial dynasties forever. Martha Firestone, the daughter of Harvey Jr. and Elizabeth, married William Clay Ford. The groom was the grandson of Henry Ford himself, the man who had been Harvey Sr.'s closest friend and biggest customer. The wedding at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Akron was called the biggest society wedding in the city's history. Newspapers across the country covered the event. Here were the heirs of two empires, the tire maker and the automaker, united in marriage just as their grandfathers had been united in business and friendship. It seemed like the perfect conclusion to a story that had begun decades earlier on those vagabond camping trips. Martha Firestone Ford would go on to become one of the most prominent women in American business. After her husband's death, she became the owner of the Detroit Lions football team, a position she held for many years. Her son, William Clay Ford Jr., would become chairman of the board of the Ford Motor Company, continuing the family legacy into the 21st century. But even as the Firestone and Ford families celebrated their union, troubles were brewing far from the champagne toasts and wedding bells. In Liberia, on the vast rubber plantation that still bore the name Harbel, workers continued to struggle under conditions that had changed little since Harvey Sr. had first carved the operation from the African jungle. The plantation's dark legacy. The Firestone plantation in Liberia had always been controversial. From the beginning, critics had questioned the labor practices, the displacement of indigenous communities, and the cozy relationship between the company and Liberia's government. But in the years after the Second World War, these concerns grew louder and more difficult to ignore. The plantation had become the most profitable subsidiary of the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. Rubber prices had risen, and the operation was generating millions of dollars in revenue each year. Yet the workers who actually tapped the trees and collected the latex saw little of this wealth. In 1950, tappers on the plantation were earning just 18 cents per day, well below even Liberia's meager minimum wage. That year, the workers went on strike. It was a desperate act of defiance against a company that controlled nearly every aspect of their lives. Firestone owned the houses they lived in, the stores where they bought their food, the schools their children attended, and the hospitals where they received medical care. To strike was to risk losing everything. The company's response was swift and harsh. Workers who refused to return to their jobs were evicted from company housing. Families found themselves homeless, cast out from the only community they had ever known. The strike collapsed, and the plantation returned to normal operations. But the underlying grievances remained, festering like an untreated wound. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the pattern repeated. Workers would organize, demand better conditions, and face retaliation. The company made some improvements, building new housing and raising wages slightly, but the fundamental relationship remained unchanged. Firestone was the master, and the workers were dependent on the company for their survival. In 1963, the largest strike in the plantation's history shut down operations for 2 weeks. Every division, every rubber grove, every processing facility went silent as workers demanded their rights. The company brought in trucks to remove strikers from company housing. Families were told that if they were not working, they could not live on company land. The strike eventually ended, as all the previous strikes had ended, with the workers returning to their jobs under essentially the same conditions. But something had changed. The world was beginning to pay attention to what was happening in Liberia. Civil rights movements were spreading across the globe, and the old colonial relationships that had defined Africa for centuries were being challenged and overturned. A mansion of memories. Back in Akron, Harvey Jr. continued to lead the Firestone Company through decades of growth and change. He expanded operations to Britain, Spain, Switzerland, and South Africa. He served as chairman of the USO during the Second World War and held appointments under President Truman. He sat on the boards of Princeton University, the YMCA, and numerous other organizations. But as the years passed, Harvey Jr. spent less time in Ohio and more time at the family's other properties. He and Elizabeth had acquired a magnificent estate in Newport, Rhode Island, called Ocean Lawn. This seaside mansion became their preferred residence, especially as Harvey's health began to decline. Elizabeth continued to build her collections, traveling the world in search of rare pieces to add to her holdings. She had become one of the most respected collectors of her generation, known for her discerning eye and scholarly approach. The items she acquired were not merely beautiful, they were historically significant, carefully chosen to represent the finest achievements of their eras. In 1973, Harvey Firestone Jr. died at the age of 75. He had led the family company for a quarter century, guiding it through wars and recessions, strikes and scandals. Under his leadership, Firestone had become one of the largest tire manufacturers in the world, with factories on every continent and products on millions of vehicles. After his death, Elizabeth moved permanently to Newport. The Akron mansion, with its Louis XVI interiors and priceless art collections, stood largely empty. She would live for another 17 years, gradually donating her collections to museums across the country. The Detroit Institute of Art, the Boston Museum of Fine Art, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art all received significant gifts. Parts of her fashion collection went to the University of Akron and the Henry Ford Museum. When Elizabeth Park Firestone died in 1990, she left behind a legacy of cultural philanthropy that rivaled her husband's business achievements. But she also left behind the Akron Mansion, the last surviving Firestone estate in the city that the family had helped build. The house that survived. Unlike Harbel Manor, which had been demolished 3 decades earlier, the Harvey Jr. mansion found new owners who appreciated its historical significance. In 1992, Samuel and Judith DePaula purchased the property and began a careful restoration. The DePaulas understood that they were not merely buying a house, they were becoming stewards of history. Instead of modernizing the interiors to suit contemporary tastes, they preserved Elizabeth Firestone's original Louis XVI design. The ornate chandeliers remained. The antique marble fireplaces stayed in place. The gilded mirrors continued to reflect the light that had illuminated countless dinner parties and social gatherings. Over the years, the DePaulas expanded the property. In 2011, they purchased an adjoining lot, increasing the estate from just under 2 acres to more than 3. They added 9 separate gardens with 3 fountains and created a 1-acre private arboretum with a large pond and waterfall. The grounds became as impressive as the house itself, a green oasis in the heart of Akron. The restoration was so faithful to the original that the mansion became a time capsule of Gilded Age elegance. Visitors who stepped through the front door found themselves transported to another era when the Firestone name meant power and prestige, when rubber barons built palaces and entertained presidents. It was Akron's last surviving connection to that vanished world. In 2019, the DePaulis put the property on the market for $8,650,000. The asking price was believed to be a record for a private home in Akron. The sale included not just the house and grounds, but also the furniture, carpets, drapes, and much of the artwork that Elizabeth Firestone had originally selected. For a buyer with the means and the vision, it was an opportunity to own a piece of American history. The Reckoning in Liberia. While the Akron mansion found preservation, the Firestone legacy in Liberia faced a very different kind of examination. In 2005, the International Labor Rights Fund filed a lawsuit in United States District Court in California. The suit alleged forced labor, the modern equivalent of slavery, on the Firestone plantation in Harbel. The lawsuit described conditions that had changed remarkably little since the plantation's founding in 1926. Workers still lived in small, cramped housing provided by the company. They still faced daily quotas for tapping rubber trees, quotas that required them to work from dawn until dark just to meet their targets. They still earned wages that kept them in poverty, dependent on the company for everything from food to medical care. Most disturbing were the allegations about child labor. The lawsuit claimed that Firestone's quota system effectively required workers to bring their children into the fields to help meet production targets. Children as young as 6 or 7 were allegedly working alongside their parents, tapping trees and carrying heavy buckets of latex under the tropical sun. Firestone, now owned by the Japanese company Bridgestone, denied the allegations. Company officials pointed to the schools, hospitals, and housing they provided for workers. They argued that the plantation brought economic opportunity to one of Africa's poorest nations. They said that any use of child labor violated company policy and was not condoned by management. The legal battle dragged on for years. In 2011, the court dismissed most of the claims regarding adult workers but allowed the case concerning child labor to proceed. The publicity surrounding the lawsuit brought unprecedented attention to conditions on the plantation. Conditions that had existed largely hidden from the world for nearly a century. Journalists and documentary filmmakers descended on Harbel. They filmed the rows of identical company houses, the endless groves of rubber trees, and the workers who rose before dawn to begin their daily rounds. They interviewed tappers who described the pressure to meet quotas, the fear of losing their jobs and homes, and the desperation that led them to bring their children to work. A company town frozen in time. What the journalists found in Harbel was a world that seemed frozen in time. The plantation operated much as it had for decades, with white managers living in comfortable houses on hilltops, while African workers crowded into simple dwellings below. The segregation that had characterized the operation since its founding persisted into the 21st century. The town of Harbel itself had grown into a substantial community, home to tens of thousands of people whose lives revolved around the plantation. There were schools and churches, markets and shops, all dependent on the rubber operation that had created them. For many residents, Firestone was not just an employer. It was the only world they had ever known. Critics compared the plantation to the old southern plantations of the American past. The big house on the hill overlooking the workers' quarters. the company store where workers spent their meager wages, the system of control that kept workers dependent and unable to leave. It was a comparison that the company vigorously rejected, but that many observers found disturbingly apt. The Liberian Civil War, which raged from 1989 to 2003, had brought additional horrors to the plantation. Rebel forces used Harbel as a base for attacks on the capital, Monrovia. Workers were caught between warring factions, forced to provide support to armed groups or face violence. The plantation manager during this period kept detailed notes of the payments and supplies demanded by rebel commanders at gunpoint. When peace finally returned to Liberia, the plantation resumed operations. But the world had changed. Global attention to labor rights and corporate responsibility made it harder for companies to operate in the shadows. The lawsuit, the documentaries, and the investigative journalism all contributed to a new scrutiny of Firestone's Liberian operations. The company responded by implementing reforms. It raised wages, improved housing, and strengthened policies against child labor. Independent monitors were brought in to verify compliance. The most egregious abuses were addressed, though critics argued that fundamental inequalities remained. The meaning of a name. Today, the name Harbel carries very different meanings depending on where you encounter it. In Akron, it evokes memories of a vanished mansion, a palace of the rubber boom that stood for nearly half a century before falling to the wrecking ball. The Georgetown condominiums that replaced it bear no trace of the grandeur that once occupied the site. In Liberia, Harbel is a living community, a place where people are born, work, and die in the shadow of the rubber trees that Harvey Firestone planted nearly a century ago. The plantation continues to operate, still the largest rubber operation in the world, still employing thousands of workers who tap trees and collect latex, much as their grandparents did. The two Harbels represent the dual legacy of the Firestone family. On one hand, there is the story of American ingenuity and ambition, of a farm boy who built an empire through hard work and innovation. On the other hand, there is the story of exploitation and inequality, of wealth built on the labor of people who never shared in its rewards. The surviving Firestone mansion in Akron stands as a monument to both legacies. Its elegant rooms and careful preservation speak to the refinement and culture that great wealth can support. But they also speak to a system that concentrated riches in the hands of a few, while others struggled in poverty. The Firestone family continues to this day. Great-grandchildren of Harvey Sr. have appeared on reality television shows, served in business and politics, and carried the family name into new generations. The connection to the Ford family, forged in that 1947 wedding, remains strong. The two dynasties that shaped American transportation in the 20th century are now permanently intertwined. Princeton University still houses the Firestone Library, named in honor of Harvey Sr. and funded by decades of family donations. The university has begun to reckon with the complicated history behind that gift, examining how the profits from the Liberia plantation helped transform a respected college into one of the world's leading research universities. A legacy carved in rubber and stone. As the sun sets over Akron, Ohio, the surviving Firestone mansion catches the last light of day. Its limestone walls glow golden in the fading sun, and its windows reflect the sky like mirrors. Inside, the chandeliers that Elizabeth Firestone selected nearly a century ago still hang from the ceilings, waiting for guests who may never come. The house has seen offers and negotiations, price reductions, and renewed interest. Whether it will find an owner who can maintain its grandeur or eventually succumb to the same fate as Harbel Manor remains to be seen. Historic preservation is expensive, and the pool of buyers willing and able to take on such a responsibility is small. But whatever happens to the physical structure, the story it represents will endure. The Firestone family's rise from an Ohio farm to the heights of American industry is a quintessentially American tale. It embodies the promise that hard work and vision can lift anyone to greatness. It celebrates the innovations that transformed transportation and connected a continent. Yet it is also a cautionary tale. The wealth that built these mansions came at a cost that was borne by others. The workers in Liberia who tapped rubber trees for pennies a day. The indigenous communities displaced to make way for plantations. The children who labored in fields instead of attending school. All of them paid a price for the Firestone fortune. The two Harbels, one demolished and one still struggling to survive thousands of miles away, remind us that every great fortune has a story behind it. Sometimes that story is one of pure innovation and hard work. More often, it is complicated, involving systems and structures that benefit some at the expense of others. Harvey Firestone built his empire on wheels, on the simple idea that rubber tires could make travel more comfortable and efficient. From that insight grew a company that spanned the globe, a family that married into American royalty, and mansions that rivaled the palaces of Europe. He died believing he had created something lasting, something that would carry his name into eternity. In a sense, he was right. The Firestone name endures on tires and libraries, on historical markers and family trees, but it also endures in Harbel, Liberia, where the descendants of workers who built his fortune still rise before dawn to tap the trees. It endures in the lawsuits and documentaries that have examined his legacy with clear eyes. It endures in the ongoing debate about what we owe to those whose labor makes our comfort possible. The mansions may crumble. The company may change hands. The family may fade from public view. But the questions raised by the Firestone story will remain as long as great fortunes are built, and as long as we ask ourselves what price is too high to pay for success. In the end, the dark story of America's tire empire mansion is not just about one family or one company. It is about all of us, about the choices we make and the systems we create, about who benefits and who pays the cost. The Firestones built their castles. The question is whether we have learned anything from watching them rise and fall. The original Harbel Manor is gone now, its stones scattered, its memories preserved only in fading photographs and the recollections of those who walked its halls. The Georgetown condominiums that stand in its placehouse ordinary families living ordinary lives, unaware that they sleep where rubber barons once entertained presidents and plotted the conquest of global markets. Across the street, the Harvey Jr. mansion still stands, a stubborn survivor in a changing world. Its future remains uncertain, caught between the desire to preserve history and the practical challenges of maintaining such an enormous property. Perhaps a buyer will emerge who sees value in its walls and stories. Perhaps it too will eventually fall, another casualty of time and changing fortunes. And in Liberia, the town of Harbel continues its daily rhythm. Workers still rise before dawn. Rubber still flows from the trees that Harvey Firestone planted nearly a century ago. Children still grow up in the shadow of an industry that has shaped their nation's history. The name that once graced an Ohio palace now marks a community of thousands, forever tied to a family they never knew. The story of the Firestone family is, in many ways, the story of America itself. It is a story of dreams realized and promises broken, of innovation and exploitation, of mansions built on the labor of those who would never walk through their doors. It is a story without a clear ending, because the consequences of choices made a century ago continue to ripple through time. When Harvey Firestone died in 1938, he could not have imagined the world we live in today. He could not have known that his company would be sold to Japanese owners, that his mansions would be demolished or nearly forgotten, that his plantation would face lawsuits and international scrutiny. He died believing in the American dream, in the rightness of his achievements, in the legacy he was leaving behind. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Firestone story. We cannot know how history will judge us. We can only make our choices and hope that future generations will understand the world we lived in and the constraints we faced. The Firestones made their choices. They built their empire. They raised their families. They left their mark on the world. Now it falls to us to decide what that mark means, to honor the innovation while acknowledging the exploitation, to preserve the history while learning from its mistakes, to remember the mansions and the people who lived in them, but also the workers who made those mansions possible. The dark story of America's tire empire mansion has no happy ending, no neat resolution. It is a story still being written, in courtrooms and boardrooms, in history books and documentaries, in the choices we make every day about how we want to live and what we are willing to accept in the name of progress. The Firestones are gone now, at least from the stage of history. Their mansions crumble or stand empty. Their company bears a different name. Their legacy is debated and dissected by scholars and journalists, but their story remains, carved in rubber and stone, a reminder that every fortune has a cost and every empire casts a shadow.